Greetings. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our HMSC research seminar today. My name is Chung Chung. I'm the academic program manager at Oregon State University, and we're really happy to have you all here in Newport and online. I'll be your host for today's talk. This is a hybrid event with folks attending both on-site and online. Rose is our hybrid support today. Please let them know, as well as Michael Banks, please let them know if you're having any technical issues so both of them they can assist or let those of us on site know. Some basic logistics for those online. We have your mics, cameras, and screen share off. Please ask any questions you might have using the chat at any time, and we will answer any questions at the end of this talk. If you put a question in the chat, Michael will read it out for everyone to hear. And you're also welcome to raise your digital hand at the end of today's talk, and we'll let you know when it's your turn to communicate through your mic. For those in the room, if you have not already, please make sure you sign in. If you haven't, of course, sign in afterwards. If you like cookies. Okay. We'll be handling questions today at the end of the talk also, so just raise your hand here and we'll bring the mic over. Recording of this seminar, as well as previous seminars, as well as our Science on Tap, will be on our seminar page, and we'll post our past seminar page in the chat for folks online. Some quick announcements. Next week's seminar, also Thursday, on July 7th at 3:30 p.m. We will have Sarah Mesnick from the NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service and Scripps Institute of Oceanography at UC San Diego. Sarah will be giving a seminar entitled Black and Blue Markets, Illegal Wildlife Trafficking, Lack of Legal Economic Alternatives, and the plight of the vaquita corpus, the world's most endangered marine mammal. Please join us in person here in this auditorium or online next week. Again, if you need any more info or details about these events, you can go onto our HMSC homepage. Scroll to the bottom for a calendar of events with all the details. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker today. We have Dr. Ryan Jones with us. He is an Ann Swindells Associate Professor in Environmental History at the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. And he is also the author of Empire Extinction, Russians and the Strange Beasts of the Sea, 1741 to 1867, as well as a relatively new book, Red Leviathan, The Secret History of Soviet Whaling. Couple other things I want to highlight is Professor Jones is accepting master's and PhD students interested in the fields of global environmental history, Russian history, Pacific history, and the history of Alaska. Again, most recently, he introduced his environmental history of the Pacific Ocean course, History 415, 515, to a full day of activities here at HMSC just last month. So without further delay, won't you join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Jones?
Thanks, Chung, for the very kind introduction and for hosting my students last month. It was really wonderful. I'm really grateful for all of you who came out today, this beautiful day here in Newport, as well as those of you joining online. Just wanted to say a special thanks to a few people who played an instrumental role in the book. One who's not here, Lee Torres, who works at the Hatfield, whose science of whale behavior I relied on for some of the chapters in this book. Thanks to Scott Baker, who's here. It's great to see you, Scott, with whom I shared some really fascinating evenings in Arkhangelsk in the middle of writing this book. And online, a huge thanks both to Yulia Ivashenko and Phil Clapham, or Phil Clapham, as I often heard him referred to in Russia, whose work was, really on this subject, the uncovering and the documenting of the extent of the Soviet Union's illegal whaling, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, is, really due to their tireless research. They were very generous in helping me understand the story of Soviet illegal whaling. So generous, in fact, that I almost forgot that they were Seahawks fans by the end of our time together and was ready to forgive that. So thanks, Phil and Yulia, for joining us as well remotely. Okay, so I'm talking about this new book. It just came out a couple of months ago. Red Leviathan, Secret History of Soviet Whaling. Though one wonders how secret it is now that it's out, but still the publishers insisted on the title Secret History. And it does deal with topics which were kept hidden by the Soviet government through the 20th century, especially the extent of the illegal whaling that they undertook, but also many more. And I want to start by just introducing a little bit of the big story of the book here, and then I'm going to focus for this audience really on this history of scientists in the Soviet Union who were there through the Soviet Union's massive illegal whaling and contributed some really unique ideas, pushed back, tried to stop some of the excesses, contributed at times as well, but throughout the period had a really fascinating history, I think. Okay, so this is maybe the image, if any, that launched this book for me. This is a picture of Greenpeace just off the coast of California, launching, what some would argue is the most influential environmental protest ever. And it was a protest against Soviet whalers. The Soviet Union was whaling really not far from here in the 1970s, catching mostly sperm whales by that time. This group of activists from Vancouver, Canada, sailed their Zodiacs, here they're small inflatable boats, to try to put themselves in between these Soviet whale ships and their prey to stop the whale hunt. They failed to stop the hunt, but what they did is they brought whaling, industrial whaling, to a global consciousness, and in the end helped put the pressure that would end Soviet and Japanese whaling for the most part. And the image was, from the first time I heard about it, just, the story just fascinated me. I mean, for the bravery of these activists. They didn't get everything right. In fact, they didn't know even half of the number of the whales that the Soviets were killing. But what they did was pretty remarkable. Also, blew my mind to think the Soviet Union, Russia, the evil empire, as we were calling it in the 1980s when I was a kid, they were whaling just 50 miles offshore from where I grew up. They were a part of my history as well. I mean, anytime one went to the ocean in the 80s and didn't see whales for the most part, since whale populations were far lower then than they are today, you were a part of this history of the Soviets' massive whaling in the second half of the 20th century. But when I looked at this picture, I thought, okay, these Greenpeace hippies are super fascinating people, but what about those people on the boat there? This rusting ship called the Dalny Vostok, the Far East. What was their story? And this really fascinated me. So over about a decade of research, I visited Russia a bunch of times, worked in the historical archives. I interviewed former whalers and former whale scientists to try to piece together, just what was the other side of the story? What was it like to be involved in these huge changes in the ocean that took place in the second half of the 20th century? What was it like to be an intimate part of the slaughter of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of whales at this time? What was it like to work in the Soviet Union? What was it like to be a scientist in the Soviet Union studying these animals? All of these answers are in the book to some degree. The one I'm going to talk about is, what about the scientists on board? And there were scientists on board. In fact, the scientist who signed the scientific report at the end of the Dalny Vostok's voyage was a prominent anti-illegal whaling activist named Fred Berzin. I don't know if he was actually on that voyage or not, but he was responsible for the scientific contingent. One of those scientists who actually helped, told the world in the 1990s what the Soviet Union had secretly been doing. Their story, I think, was one of the most interesting stories for me. What was it like to work, with thousands and thousands of whale specimens? What was it like to work in one of the most repressive regimes in world history that tried to control scientific thought in many ways? Well, here's the story. Russia has a pretty fascinating, rich history of scientific thought. And I'll just point to sort of three aspects here, which predated the Soviet Union, created in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution, but which continued in important ways. The first of these is ethology, right? The study of animal behavior. Russians were very interested in these questions, in part because of some of the revolutionary scientists of Imperial Russia. People like Pyotr Kropotkin, who was both an anarchist and a biologist. And his major contribution to Russian environmental thought was the idea that, hey, look, Darwin was right in a lot of ways, but he was wrong about competition. Actually, we see a lot of cooperation in the natural world. And this is part of the story of evolution. Now, right or wrong, this was an idea which really appealed to early communists because they were trying to create a society which was smoothing the rough edges of competition off to try to form a truly cooperative society where private property would be abolished. And they found these ideas very attractive. Look, if actually cooperation is natural, and the Soviets believed very deeply in the power of science to chart the future of their society. Officially atheists, they were getting rid of God. Science was what they were going to rely on. If science told them cooperation was natural, this was really an attractive idea. Similarly, Soviet scientists, or Russian and then Soviet scientists, were very interested in questions of community biology, biocenosis, as they called it. This is a picture depicting ecosystems and biocenosis here. The idea that ecosystems only function as collective systems. Right? There's a collection of organisms. This appealed for similar reasons to Soviet scientists. If our society is a truly collective society, it functions kind of like an ecosystem. And this was connected to one last idea, the idea of wise use, which was the idea that if we're going to get rid of private property, competition, if the state and the scientists are going to be at the center of this new society, well, they are going to be the ones to tell us how much to take out of the natural world, how much is sustainable. And to understand how to do that, we have to be able to measure ecosystems, ecosystem productivity, etc. And if we just listen to them, we're going to create a truly sustainable society over the long run. We don't have to worry about people maximizing their profits and destroying the natural world down to the very last individual. We'll have scientists telling us how much we can take and where we need to stop. Okay, these at least were some of the ideals that the Soviet Union preached starting in the 1920s, and we see some real examples of successes, by the way. They expanded the Soviet, what some people call Soviet national parks, the Zapovedniki system. This is the Zapovednik over here in the Russian Far East, created in 1934 under Stalin's regime. And these were nature preserves set aside purely for scientific study. No tourists like in the US. These were places where you would have a kind of model of the natural world. Without humans, you could study it and really understand how biocenosis and things like that worked and how much one could extract from other ecosystems. These were some of the ideas that Soviet scientists were working with. They were also, if I can advance this slide, working though in a society that was determined to catch up to the West through industrial production. And we see in the beginning, especially in the 1930s, the creation of a number of scientific institutions specifically designed to think about more narrow questions. Really, how do we increase fish catches, for example? I have a picture down here of TINRO. This is the Pacific Institute of Fisheries and Oceanography, founded, if I'm not mistaken, in 1936 in the Russian Far Eastern city of Vladivostok. This is the Moscow Central Institute of Fisheries. These were places that were really, hey, let's study the natural world in detail to figure out how we can use more of it. Right? The scientists will tell us when we need to stop, but our first problem is to figure out how do we get more out of the natural world because we're desperately poor compared to the West in particular. So this clearly urged scientists to think along more narrowly instrumentalist lines of studying for maximum extraction. On the other hand, some of these deeper questions persisted in the Soviet Union. I'll just give you a picture of the Russian Academy of Sciences, an institution brought over from the imperial era, in which some of the really most creative, interesting thought took place. That building, which is really prominent on the Moscow skyline today, was not actually there during this time period I'm going to talk about, but it gives you a sense of the importance that science maintained throughout the Soviet Union, building these huge monuments to scientific inquiry. All right. What's the story then in connection with whaling? Well, whaling, the Soviets had Russia had a long tradition of being frustrated with whaling. They set out the sail whaling era while they saw Americans sail to Siberia and kill lots and lots of whales on their shores. Russians never could do something similar. But in 1932, under Stalin's second five-year plan, this was the massive industrialization of the Russian economy, preparing in part for the Second World War. The Soviet Union finally got its first whaling industry off the ground. This was the so-called Aleut fleet. You see a picture of the Aleut there, winching up a whale through its stern slipway. This was modern industrial style whaling, where you process the whale on board, diesel engines, expanding the range, etc. One of the, so it was a fairly small operation that was in the North Pacific. It whaled a little bit near Alaska, mostly in Siberian waters. One of the interesting things, and you probably won't be surprised to hear now, is that Russian scientists were on board, right? From the very beginning. The idea was that they needed scientists to chart these waters to try to figure out where the whales were, what the migration routes were. Russians knew very little about their own waters because they hadn't been whaling, but also to give them some guidance in terms of conservation strategies. One man in particular, this is his book by B.A. Zenkovich. He wrote the book Around the World for Whales, Вокруг света за китами. It's a fantastic book. They stop in Honolulu, amongst other places, on the first Russian round the world voyage expedition, and there's crazy stories that take place. People jumping ship to stay in Honolulu, people jumping ship from Honolulu to ship with the Soviets. I don't know who to believe, but a lot of intrigue. Zenkovich, fascinatingly, you can see, his task was to figure out where the whales were, but he was also really interested just in, what do whales do? How do they behave? Some of these older questions of ethology were front and center in his mind. These are some of the illustrations from his book, one showing a pod of gray whales and one showing sperm whales leaping out of the ocean. And Zenkovich also provided lectures on board to the whalers, where he taught them about the whale behavior. From what little he himself knew, he taught them about the history of whaling. And this reflected, not only this kind of different legacy of Russian science, but also the fact that at a time when in the West, people were still whaling, the Norwegians, the Germans, the British. Their scientists, though, were increasingly, and they would, especially in the 50s and 60s, move off the whaling ship and study whales from laboratories, from ashore, sometimes at shore whaling stations, while Russians really became embedded, the scientists, in the whaling fleets themselves. This is something the historian of science, Graham Burnett, called hip-booted science. That means you're literally slogging in amongst the carcasses with your hip boots to keep you from getting too disgusting from whale guts. This is a picture of a Soviet marine biologist here doing his hip-booted science. And it meant that Russian Soviet scientists were drawn to some different questions than were Western scientists. And it was these questions of whale communities, whale families, whale behaviors, things that they saw while they were on board these whaling ships at a time when those questions were not really front and center for whale scientists around the world. Just to take one example, here's from Zinkovich's observations, an article entitled Observations of the Whales of the Russian Far East. And here he described what was clearly for him kind of a heart-rending scene of the whalers killing a mother whale, a calf here, and the mother trying to protect it. They ended up, of course, killing both the mother and the calf. Zinkovich also warned Soviet planners in Vladivostok that gray whales, which were not legal to be hunted in most of the world by this time, were rapidly decreasing. And they actually stopped the hunt for gray whales. The Soviet scientists, the Soviet government was willing to listen to its scientists, at least in the 1930s. Other scientists would take these interests much further through the 1950s and 60s. They studied captive dolphins. They claimed repeatedly that whales were actually altruistic. This was in line with some of Kropotkin's idea that cooperation was really important in natural history. One study that I read, talked about a dolphin which would come to the aid of wounded companions in a tank. These experiments were not very ethical. I'll warn you of that. They would wound this dolphin, and then when it was wounded, it wouldn't help its wounded companions. And this, to Soviet scientists, was proof that altruism was some kind of a choice that whales were making, because when they no longer considered it worth it, they would stop making this choice. But they really pushed the idea of animal altruism, play, etc., quite far. And we see this, and much earlier, by the way, than scientists in the rest of the world, questions of communication and play became really important for Western scientists by the 1960s. But the Soviets were really interested in this from a very, very early time period. Take one more example. And this, one of the key scientists in the Soviet Union was a man by the name of Avenir Grigorievich Tamilin. This is Tamilin here with a Black Sea dolphin. Tamilin, like Zinkovich, got his start in the whaling industry in the North Pacific. And there he noted, as he saw whales being hunted, that they seemed to have extraordinary communicative abilities. You would harpoon one sperm whale, and then suddenly a whole group of sperm whales would coalesce from who knows how far away. They hadn't been visible to anyone else. And he thought, okay, they must be communicating in some way, and in some pretty sophisticated way, because they're not just communicating, but they're communicating specific information, like danger in this case. He thought humpbacks could do the same. He thought they'd made noises like cuckoo birds. I'm not sure if that checks out, but certainly this was one of the claims that he made. And when Tamilin moved to the Black Sea and started studying dolphins, there was a small dolphin catching industry there. He pushed these claims much further. And he observed, for example, dolphins' pods being rounded up, and he thought, well, this is remarkable. You have a mass of thrashing dolphins, trying to escape this net. And somehow, the mothers who are still outside the net locate their calves in this just confused swarm of dolphins. They must have some way of identifying individuals within this pod. It was kind of heartbreaking stuff to read, but, he was making pretty extraordinary claims for the ability of whales to communicate in really quite sophisticated ways. Maybe for me, the most surprising part was the conclusion he came to. As Tamilin said, hey, look, if we can just figure out how to imitate the sounds of whales, we can catch a lot more. Make a few of the right clicks, put them in the water, dolphins will come swarming to you. You don't even have to go hunt for them. Or sperm whales or humpback whales, whichever you're trying to catch. If you can just imitate these sounds, they will come to you. And we can increase our catches by quite a bit. Fascinating, right? In many of the standard accounts of the switch, the way that people in the West started thinking differently about whales, a humpback song is one of those key moments when people first heard the song of humpback whales. realized how beautiful it was, and the recordings that Roger Payne made in the 1960s. Their kind of mental image switched. These were graceful giants. Soviets had come to similar conclusions about 30 years earlier with the exact opposite final conclusion. It is a perfect way to catch more whales now that we understand the sounds that they're making. Soviet science got much more complicated after the Second World War. During that time period, for those of you who don't know the history here, Stalin, victorious in the Second World War, had decided that he really needed to insert himself into Soviet science. He was an expert, and he used this man, Trofim Lysenko, to really push his idea of how Soviet science should be arranged. And Lysenko is famous for preaching and really enforcing a kind of another revision of Darwin, a revival of Lamarckian evolution, the idea that traits which are acquired during one's lifetime can be passed on to the offspring. In other words, not natural selection, but these other changes can be inherited. This was really attractive to Soviet agronomists and others because Lysenko thought, well, we just train crops to be drought resistant, and then the seeds will also be drought resistant. He also believed in cooperation instead of competition. We can teach plants to cooperate with each other. It was disastrous in a lot of ways for Soviet agronomy, but it was rigidly enforced across all fields of Soviet science. And this happened to occur at the same time that the Soviet Union was first expanding its whaling industry into the Antarctic, the largest whaling ground in the world. They took over an ex-Nazi whaler, rechristened it the Slava, and started hunting whales in the Antarctic from 1946. And it also coincided with a boom in Soviet whale science. All of the whale scientists were now granted access to the Antarctic, as well as whaling stations here in the Kuril Islands, also the North Pacific, which were taken over from the Japanese at the end of the Second World War. And I want to linger on this for a second. One of the more interesting Soviet whale scientists worked out of one of these whale stations, which you can see here disintegrating back into the tundra here in the Kuril Islands. He worked for a number of years. This was a man by the name of Makar Mitrofanovich Sleptsov. Very hard to find information about Sleptsov. He apparently, he kept a very low profile, had a wicked sense of humor, according to some people. But he was working at maybe, the time with the most opportunities for Soviet whale scientists. He was seeing all sorts of specimens coming in now at his whaling station. Also the most difficult. He was forced to preach Lysenkoism and adopt it in all of his publications. And it was, I found it very fascinating to read his 1948 textbook, which was really the first Soviet textbook on whales, called Giganti Okeanov, or Giants of the Oceans. And at first I didn't really understand what Sleptsov was doing, because he said a lot of crazy things in this textbook. First of all, my first book I wrote about sea otters and Stiller's sea cow, which you may know went extinct in 1768. Russian fur traders killed it for food until it was all gone. Well, Sleptsov, he wrote about the sea cow as well, and he said, well, as everyone knows, the Norwegians killed the sea cow. I just had to laugh. Norwegians were nowhere near the North Pacific in 1768, but I realized, this was Sleptsov's little joke. He threw in something so absurd here that any reader who knew anything about this would immediately recognize what Sleptsov was doing, which is that he was towing the official line, which said all foreigners are bad after the Second World War. Russians have never done anything wrong, while alerting people to the fact that he didn't actually believe any of this. And what he managed to do with his whale science was something fascinatingly similar. He made all sorts of really crazy claims. I mean, first of all, Sleptsov was he loved the Kuril Islands. He found that they were exceptionally abundant. This is where a couple of currents come together. He studied sperm whales. This is a birthing ground for sperm whales. Clearly, he absolutely just loved his research subject. Talked about these magical zones of fertility. But when he started talking about whale science, he parroted the kind of Lysenkoism. A couple of quotes here, right? Humans capable of modifying nature far more quickly than nature itself changes. This is exactly what Stalin wanted to hear, right? We're able to just reshape the natural world any way that we want. And he said, look, whales are a great example. Whales are capable somehow of remembering danger, so to speak, possess conditioned reflexes. The experience accumulated through centuries fixes itself in the nervous system of the animals and gets inherited by its descendants. This was classical Lysenkoism, the idea that, look, if you hunt a whale, it gets freaked out. Its babies will also be wary of humans because it inherits this behavior. Sleptsov, and I really only realized this as I came to the end of his textbook, right, was agreeing with Lysenko and Stalin that actually humans possess unbelievable ability to reshape the natural world, but actually the results were really awful, as Sleptsov pointed out elsewhere. Look, he tried to tag sperm whales. The idea was they would, when they were recovered, when the marks would be recovered later, you'd get a sense of how far they migrated. Well, every sperm whale Sleptsov tagged was killed like the next day. So he got no data whatsoever, and he was horrified by what was going on here in the Kuril Islands. He was not the only one. I'll give you one more example. This is a guy by the name of Klumov, who worked in the Darwin Museum. And Klumov also used Lysenkoism to push back against the expansion of the Soviet whaling industry. Klumov kind of came to an opposite conclusion. He said, and the quote up here expresses this, the idea that, hey, look, whales are fixed to one hemisphere or the other because they're habituated, their habits, which they're used to the northern hemisphere, get passed down to their children through Lysenkoist evolution, right? So there's no way that they can cross from one hemisphere to the next. Now, it may not be obvious why this is a pushback against Soviet whaling, but it was precisely because the idea amongst many biologists and state planners was, hey, look, so we kill a few thousand whales in this part of the ocean, they'll just be replaced by others migrating in from somewhere else. And Klumov said, no, look, I believe Lysenko, like wink, wink. Klumov is actually known to be a major opponent of Lysenko. I believe Lysenko, and what Lysenko tells us is that actually whales can't replace depleted populations because they're incapable of migrating across hemispheres because they've inherited a preference for one hemisphere or the other. Ridiculous science in a lot of ways, but the kind of what Soviets called Aesopian language, speaking in metaphor, that scientists had to do during this time period. Now, this approach had the potential to make a real difference in the Soviet Union because in 1956, the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, announced that the Soviet Union was going to build 9 new whaling fleets. This was at a time when every scientist around the world recognized that whales had been horrendously overhunted. In the 1930s, small pause during the Second World War, but with a renewed attack in the 1950s. In fact, many whaling nations, like the Norwegians and like the Norwegians and the British, were getting out of whaling. They were actively looking to sell their whaling fleets because it was becoming no longer profitable. At the same time, in this exact moment, the Soviet Union was proposing to embark on the largest expansion of whaling power that any country had ever undertaken. Well, what did they do? They asked the scientists. This was what I described at the beginning. They turned to the scientists for economic advice. Can the ecosystem support this? And the answers were resoundingly clear. As Klumov said, not profitable from an economic, actually said not from an economic or moral point of view. So Klumov was a no. Zinkovich said, well, yeah, we could do it, but will result in the total extinction of whales. If you're cool with that, go ahead and build these. Sleptsov said, we actually need to take radical measures to conserve the remains of these North Pacific sperm whale stocks, and should include the total banning of their catches. And then this one's a little earlier, but I thought it was kind of a touching remark from a grad student who said, whales do so much for us. They deserve for humans to take care of them and protect them from destruction. So basically everyone said, this is crazy. Don't do it. What did the Soviet Union do? What did Khrushchev decide? He did. Well, they only built 5 new whaling fleets, including the 2 largest ever built. The 2 ships, the sister ships you see are the Sovietskaya Ukraina and the Sovietskaya Russia, the Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet Russia. And the results, well, they were predictable, right? These new whaling fleets sailed out. They sailed onto oceans which had been drastically depleted over the last 2 decades, and they had to radically expand the scope of what was already a secret and illegal whaling. Illegal in the sense that the Soviet Union had signed up to the International Whaling Convention, which regulated the catch of whales. And lest I paint too rosy a picture of Soviet whale scientists here, many of them said, hey, look, this is crazy, as I showed you, but if you have to do it, go here. Sleptsov, for example, said, stop hunting the Kurils. Take a look up in the Bering Strait. Think about Alaska. What about Hawaii? Actually, the Dalny Vostok was in California waters, thanks in part to Sleptsov, saying, leave my sperm whales alone. Go kill sperm whales somewhere else. And it was Soviet whale scientists who helped point to one particular part of the ocean that they figured probably still had some whale stocks. This was so-called Area 5. You see the 5 there. This is called Rayon 5 in Russian, just south of Australia and New Zealand, where the stormy seas, bad weather had kept smaller whale ships mostly out. Now with the new big whaling fleets, the Soviets hit Area 5 repeatedly from 1959 to 1964, taking mostly humpbacks. There was supposed to be a 4-day season on humpbacks at that time. They whaled throughout the Antarctic summer, killing 11,000 in 1960 while reporting 720, killing almost 10,000 the following year while reporting about 300 back to the IWC. And this is some of the figures that Yulia Vashenko has put together, which are pretty astounding. The overall illegal kills of whales in this is just the Antarctic, smaller but also substantial kills that took place in the North Pacific. So obviously the Soviet model for science advising its economics failed in the end, failed spectacularly. It had all of the potential. Scientists actually gave planners good information in the end to the best of their own abilities. They were unable to stop, though. The Soviet Union's really reckless and ultimately pretty dishonest pursuit of economic gain. And scientists were implicated in some ways. And as I said, they often would tell planners to, okay, if you have to do it, just go somewhere else. But I want to end this story on a more positive note and say that many of these whale scientists who observed the massive illegal whaling of the 60s and part of the 70s as well, kept the records. And they were the ones who ended up telling people what had gone on, revealing the secrets. Here's a picture of a couple of them. This is Yuri Mikhailov in the center, Dmitry Tormasov right behind me. This is Yulia Vashenko here, and Nikolai Doroshenko many years later, but they secretly kept some of these records. And just to bring it back to the beginning, couple of other really important scientists in the 60s and 70s. On the far right, this is my far left. This is Essie Kleinenberg. One of his students, Alexei Yablokov, who later became the first head of Russian Greenpeace. And Kleinenberg and Yablokov were both really important during this time period for pushing back bravely against all odds. Kleinenberg studied the Black Sea dolphins that Tamilin had first described, and actually his work became so popular in the Soviet Union that in 1966, members of one company wrote to the fisheries minister and said, please stop killing Black Sea dolphins. Kleinenberg is doing this incredible work with them. He's described their lives in such beautiful detail. Why are we killing these? Soviet Union stopped killing them. They were the first country to outlaw the catch of small cetaceans, 1966. I have to check my book on the exact year, but it's close to that. Yablokov, as I said, is one of his students through the 1970s. In fact, just months before the Greenpeace confrontation, was begging the Soviet Union, the fisheries ministry, to stop killing undersized sperm whales. If they'd only listened to him, the whole Greenpeace fiasco for the Soviet Union might have been avoided altogether. And finally, I'll finish back with the guy Tamilin, who recommended using dolphin sounds to catch more dolphins. Tamilin became close friends with Yablokov in the Academy of Sciences and elsewhere. By the end of his career, easily the most famous whale scientist by the 1970s, had really taken an entirely different approach. What many people call the Bible of Soviet cetology in the world of whales and dolphins, the Mire kitov и delfinov, which he published in 1974. Fascinating. He called for a 50-year moratorium on all whale hunting. He also described dolphins as sentient, highly intelligent creatures, which he compared to dogs. Why are we still killing these animals that are so intelligent and provide so much use to us as well? And Tamilin's work, which I think comes from this deep tradition of Russian interest in animal behavior, especially altruism and things like that, as well as his experience on board whale ships and his close observation of whale behavior, culminated in what was really a turning point for many Soviet citizens as well. Those who read In the World of Whales and Dolphins increasingly spoke out against the Soviet Union's own whaling industry, writing letters in to the newspapers saying, why are we still doing this? It wasn't just Greenpeace who contributed to an end of commercial whaling. It was also Soviet scientists who really influenced people within their own country to think differently about these creatures over the long period of Soviet whaling. Thank you.
Great presentation. Do we have questions? Yes.
Two questions.
Yeah.
What were the Soviets using whales for? Was it like their fat or their meat? And then also, was there any evidence that you discovered of scientists trying to mislead the whaling ships to so they wouldn't catch whales?
No, on the second one, if they were misleading the whale ships, they also did it. They did it subtly enough to mislead me as well, since I saw no evidence that they were pointing their whale ships in the wrong direction. It's a tantalizing possibility, though. I guess I hadn't totally considered it as I was looking at some of the evidence that they might be deliberately misleading. The results would seem to suggest otherwise, because they did continue to increase their catches pretty consistently, not always. The first one, sorry, remind me real quick of what your first question was about. Yes, what do they use it for? Of course. The idea at the very beginning was to use it for the meat for human food. When they first got the industry going in the 1930s, they said, "Hey, look at the Japanese. They're making all sorts of money off of selling meat, consuming meat at home. We could do the same. We're in an economic crisis. Russia, just after the Bolshevik Revolution, people were starving, especially in the Far East. This really distant place from Moscow that was embroiled in civil war up through the 1920s. So planners who had been pushing for whaling for a while really thought about, look, if we can teach our people to eat whale meat, then we can stop importing food. It will increase our balance of trade and just also save us a lot of money. Everyone rejected whale meat in the Soviet Union. They never found a successful market for it. Mostly already by the 1934, 2 years after they started, they were like, we got all this whale meat. We don't know what to do with it. I guess we should feed it to the dogs or use it for paint thinner. These were the uses that they started turning to. But so after Antarctic whaling began, they had figured out a way, as had the rest of the world, to hydrogenize it and turn it into basically odorless fats, which turned into margarine. So most whale products were consumed as margarine throughout the Soviet Union. So people would have been consuming it really without even knowing that they were eating whale. If you were in Moscow or St. Petersburg, a lot of people went to a lot of work to tell them, look, you're eating whale. Isn't this amazing? But I think people just said, oh, it's just margarine. Because margarine could come from a lot of different fats. So that was mostly where it ended up, as well as some medications as well.
Any questions online?
I see one over here as well.
What about modern whale scientists? What's their position? And I mean, the government's very different, but it's not so different from when Stalin was there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Russia doesn't have a commercial whaling industry now, so the questions are a little bit different. Scott and I, at this conference in Arkhangelsk, I think saw some, really fascinating examples of Russian scientists now studying, using drone technology, et cetera, to really get a sense of whale populations, especially in the Russian Far East. And it's notable that, I don't know if any of you remember this, but some people in the Russian Far East decided a few years ago to start provisioning the Chinese market for captive orcas and beluga whales. And so they captured a bunch, I think it was in 2018, and kept them in a so-called whale prison off Vladivostok, ready for transshipment. And Russian scientists really banded together to protest the live capture and the provisionment of the Chinese captive industry. So they do continue a tradition, I think, of being at least somewhat at odds with the government. I don't think it's fair to say that of every whale scientist, and certainly there were some whale scientists in the 70s in particular who continued to insist, not inaccurately, by the way, that whale stocks were rebounding. Stocks like minke whales, for example, would be sustainable for a very long time to hunt, who bitterly opposed the moratorium in 1986. So a picture of pushback is not the whole picture for the Soviet Union or today in Russia. There's certainly cooperation with the government as well. I should say Russian whale scientists, they were also quite instrumental in making sure that the Western gray whale population was at least somewhat protected from the oil development off Sakhalin Island in the 1990s. That was a big push by Russian whale scientists.
So Phil online is saying it's worth noting that the reason everyone ignored scientific recommendations was the Soviet economic system valued meeting production targets over anything.
Yeah, and regardless of what they might have said, well, I think it differed depending on the time period, but certainly the post-war period, and this is one of the things that stuck out to me in my own research, was that, Khrushchev's period, which if you know anything about the Soviet Union, this was the period of openness. Khrushchev in 1956 said, look, it's time to get away from the ugly anti-cosmopolitanism and the repression and the violence of Stalin's years. And we need to get past that. We're tired of killing each other. Let's take a break from that. let's open up to some degree. That was the period that was most invested in this kind of economic growth. That was, and these production targets, that was the period which we really see unchecked exploitation of the natural world. I'm not here to stick up for Stalin's environmental record, but I think it's better in comparison with what came in the 1950s and the 1960s. But by the way, a great boom period for the Soviet economy.
Thank you very much for all you've shared. I was just wondering whether you came across any examples of exchange between Western scientists and the Russian scientists, and if you have anything you learned about that relationship.
Yeah, very interesting relationship. You know, there are many examples of Soviet scientists, again, speaking somewhat cryptically, trying to communicate what was going on to Western scientists, trying to communicate that there was actually, hey, look a little closer. These numbers don't all add up, do they? There's the huge, we're killing a lot more whales than you know. Sometimes looking in the papers of Western biologists as well, sometimes their colleagues, Russian colleagues just admitted it openly when they were able to meet in the 1970s, when there was far more scientific cooperation between Westerners and the Soviet Union. There they could speak a little bit more openly. Yablokov tried to communicate some of what was going on to Western scientists. I think it's unfair to draw too much of a contrast, though, really, in terms of, I'm not saying you did this, but in general, between Western and Russian attitudes towards killing whales through much of this time period. Often what would happen, the Soviet fleet would stop in a place like Australia or New Zealand, especially in the 50s and early 60s. And everyone there would go, this is amazing. What beautiful ships you have. What incredible whale killing apparatus. How can we do what you're doing? And so I don't want to paint a picture of the Soviets, as the only ones with a kind of, without really that much care for how many whales were being taken out of the ocean at that time. Whaling enjoyed a certain amount of fascination and cultural cachet, at least until the late 1960s in the West. I mean, just a little bit later in the Soviet Union as well. But yeah, there were, it was hard to communicate. I mean, Soviet whale science is poorly known in the West, even though they were doing some pretty remarkable things from the 1930s, in part because these ideas were not circulated throughout the world. It was very difficult to get a hold of Soviet whale science. And of course, that was assuming you could read Russian in the first place.
Other questions?
Do you have a sense of how much the Soviet whaling had an impact on the populations? Is it hard to parse that out from just like all of the overall whaling? And then also, how's the recovery going for those populations?
Yeah, I would recommend on some of those questions to take a look at Phil and Yulia's work, which is really excellent in those ways and goes into far greater detail than I'm able to on that. But I think in general, the answer depends on which species you're talking about. I think, blue whales, for example, had been heavily exploited by Norwegians, Japanese, and British in particular before the Second World War. And the Soviets got in late on blue whale exploitation. Now, the maybe special talent of the Soviet Union was its ability to ignore prices and continue to hunt whales when it was not profitable. So doing that kind of hard work of taking a species from depleted to almost entirely gone. So even if they killed a smaller number of blue whales, for example, they were probably one of the main contributors to killing. No one knows how low blue whale populations got down to, but many people thought they were probably extinct in the 19th. At the time, they thought they might be even extinct. Maybe it got down to 200, 300 individuals. Don't quote me on those numbers. I don't think anyone really knows, right? But certainly the Soviets were pretty impactful in killing these dwindling populations. And then for other species like fin whales, sei whales, the Soviets were really pretty important. They killed a lot of fin whales, which really sustained the global hunt in the second half of the 20th century, which is when the Soviets did about 99% of their hunting was during that time period. And certainly the story of the Southern Hemisphere humpbacks is one which is, Australians and New Zealanders were killing them from shore stations, but the numbers that the Soviets took, they really contributed to the near extinction of those populations, which, by the way, to answer the other part of your question, have rebounded exceptionally. Humpbacks seem to have been very resilient. Humpbacks were very rare in the 1960s in many parts of the world, difficult to see one. Today, they're often the most commonly seen kind of whale in those places. Other species like blue whales, much, much slower to recover.
It's Phil again. He says eastern North Pacific right whales, they wiped out almost all of them. Estimate today is around 30 animals.
And Soviets went back and they killed southern right whales as well, any number of endangered species that had been protected. They killed pretty indiscriminately.
So you said that at the time there wasn't a lot of communication between Western and Soviet scientists. Would you say now that some of that knowledge is being more incorporated on a kind of global scale?
I think so. I would probably defer to real whale scientists. I'm a whale historian who studies whale scientists. But I think that the level of cooperation, well, there's no comparison right now in Soviet times. Until at least February 2022, right? There was all sorts of communication. I think those circles still persist. I know that I'm still in contact with some of the former Soviet whale scientists. But I think it's also fair to say that some of the people that I profiled here, Yuri Mikhailov, for example, who was quite courageous in pushing back against illegal whaling at the time, has also become very disenchanted with Western whale scientists who he feels like have not been willing to sort of come forth, especially the Japanese, by the way, with their own admissions, like the Russians were. Right? And that has sowed, in his mind at least, and maybe some others, a certain degree of mistrust there. I'm not saying it's necessarily justified, but relationships are not simple. I guess this is obviously a very difficult history, a pretty toxic history to deal with. Even those people who helped expose it feel like, hey, we were not the only ones. Why is Russia being singled out as the major perpetrators? Well, they were the major perpetrator, but they were not the only one. But yeah, I think, Russian whale scientists in general are pretty closely connected to a larger community of whale science, if some barriers still persist.
Okay, I think that concludes our session. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Ryan for giving a wonderful presentation today. And for all the students in the room and online, all of our summer session students, our summer interns, our graduate students, and I would even recommend highlight our postdocs. We'll be meeting in the classroom across the hall for just a 30-minute chit chat informal session with our speaker, online via hybrid as well, Zoom and in person. So grab another cup of coffee and any remaining cookies and head over there, and we'll just meet in there at 4:45. And don't forget to sign out.